Have you ever felt like someone was watching you even when you're sure you're alone? Imagine a peaceful night at the beach, waves crashing, stars overhead. But then, you hear a faint buzz. A drone, maybe. Or something far more sinister. In tonight's tale, two friends encounter an eerie sound that follows them in the dead of night, leading them to a terrifying discovery. A shadowy figure watching from the dunes. But that's not all. What happens when you realize that even after you've run, you're still being tracked? Before we dive into this spine-chilling story, please like and subscribe. Keep your eyes open. You never know who's watching. Story number 1. I was around 25. I lived in a beach town and my neighborhood was about a 20-minute walk away from the beach. Approximately 80% of my personality was beach-related. I've been surfing for longer than I can remember, and shaking out shoes without some sand would be unusual. My two best friends, Armin and Chuck, were extroverted, outgoing, and charismatic. We were all 18 and obsessed with girls. It was a Saturday night in late May, only a few weeks before school started. Senioritis had set in and my friends and I began pushing the limits of what we could get away with without getting in trouble. We had already received our COED college acceptance letters, so we no longer cared about high school. Armin and I had planned to meet up with two girls from our high school, with whom we had been getting along very well. The plan was to pick them up in the evening and spend a cool, breezy night at the beach. We had blankets and a few bottles of wine, the ideal combination for stargazing on the beach. I don't support drinking and driving in any capacity, but I was just a stupid kid. I arrived at Sophia's house shortly after 9 o'clock. She and Fran danced in the car. They had clearly been drinking beforehand. Armin and I exchanged excited grins. This would be a wonderful night. I took a scenic route to a beautiful beach. It was approximately a 30-minute drive. The four of us had a wonderful time in the car, cracking jokes and talking about some mutual friends. Fran and I were having a deep philosophical discussion about the nature of time, death, etc. We were all thoroughly enjoying each other's company. The beach I chose had a dirt path that could be driven up in a car. We would then walk down a narrower sand path. The path was quite steep, but I chose it because we were less likely to encounter other people in such a remote area. Furthermore, since this beach was farther away from the main boardwalk, the sky would be clearer for stargazing. I thought of everything. I parked my car as far up the dirt road as possible and we got out. Armin and I carried the blankets and the wine. I'll skip the boring stuff. After a few hours and an empty bottle, Armin and I decided to separate. He and Fran walked up the beach while Sophia and I walked oppositely. After being separated by a reasonable amount of distance and darkness, I threw my blanket down, and we drunkenly fell asleep on it. Sophia tensed up before anything else happened. Before she said anything, I thought I did it. Do you hear that? I concentrated and strained my ears, hoping to hear something other than the gentle crashing of ocean waves. I assumed she was simply drunk, but I heard something to my surprise. It sounded almost like a whirring as if coming from a small engine. The sound appeared to be moving around. I couldn't figure out where it came from, and then it disappeared. It's nothing, I reassured her, eager to resume our previous activities. So that's what we did. My shirt was shaken out of the sand and thrown over my head soon after. Sophia, who was still lying on the blanket, let out a shriek. I turned to look at her and noticed she was pointing upwards at something. I looked up and saw nothing but the blackness of the sky. I sat beside her to get a better perspective and was horrified. From her perspective, the moon was perfectly aligned with what appeared to be a drone floating directly overhead. It hovered briefly before soaring into the night sky and disappearing from view. Everything made sense. The previous noise we heard was undoubtedly caused by the drone. I became frustrated with myself for not realizing it at the time. I then felt sick at the thought of being watched the entire time. Sophia looked at me and seemed to share my feelings. She put her head in her hands and began to cry. I consoled her as best I could before suggesting we return to the car. We arrived at the car and found Armin and Fran already there. I quickly described the situation. The two of them were stunned, and I could feel the joy in the air being taken away. I began driving silently toward Sophia's house, eventually trying to lighten the mood with some conversation. It didn't work, though. The girls agreed that they did not feel safe returning home just yet. It was a Saturday night, so I was fine staying late. I asked if we could hang out at either of their homes. They both shook their heads, saying their parents would not allow it. My house and Armand's were off the table for the same reason. I decided to ask Armand to call Chuck, which he did. Chuck's house was massive, and his parents were extremely chill. It was truly the perfect location. To our delight, Chuck was available. I pulled into Chuck's driveway and parked my car. Armand and the two girls began making their way toward Chuck's front door, and I told them I'd catch up with them in a moment. I needed a second to process everything that had just happened. I was more shaken than I let on, so I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes to calm down. Closing my eyes for a few seconds helped a lot. I instinctively pulled out my phone, which I hadn't touched since the incident. The screen lit up and I focused on the notification. I blinked a few times to ensure I wasn't seeing things. My whole body froze as I stared in horror at the single notification. AirTag noticed you were on the move. Every emotion I had just expelled from my body came rushing back. We were literally being tracked. I snapped out of my stupor and jumped out of the car, inspecting every inch of it. Nothing was on the front bumper, the grille, or the back. I became desperate, checking the seats and flipping the floor mats. Still, nothing. Sweat was now pouring down my neck, and I could feel the hairs on my arms and legs clamping up. I got on my hands and knees and started inspecting the underside of my car. I got to the driver's side tire and started feeling around it. There it was. It was taped to the well's underside, making it only possible to find if you knew what you were looking for. I held the tag briefly before hurling it to the ground and smashing it apart. Whoever saw us on the beach with that drone knew where we were. I didn't feel safe being alone in Chuck's driveway. I picked up one of the broken AirTag pieces and dashed to Chuck's front door. I told everyone what I'd discovered and showed them the AirTag pieces as proof. They were more horrified than I was, particularly the girls. They checked their phones and found the same notification. Chuck was especially irritated because we had been potentially tracked back to his house. After the panic subsided, we spent the rest of the night in Chuck's basement and eventually slept over. A few weeks passed, and nothing happened. My friends and I were relieved to forget the whole thing as if it had never happened. The only way we could explain it was that some creep wanted to watch some young adults hook up on the beach and track their cars to scare them. The thought was chilling, but we were relieved the situation had not worsened. Chuck called me on Sunday morning about 3 weeks after the incident occurred. He yelled over the phone for me to drive to his house as soon as possible, so I did. When I arrived, he was standing in his driveway with a concerned expression and some paper in his hand. I was confused until I realized what he was holding. They were not papers, but rather pictures. I looked at them more closely. Photos of me from that night on the beach. They were grainy and dimly lit, but you could see Sophia and me wearing revealing outfits. I felt disgusted. I could only imagine Sophia's reaction once she found out. We did not know what to do, so we called the cops and explained the situation. They said they could do nothing, but we insisted they scan and print the photos. They eventually responded, stating that the photos had yielded no results. Sophia was terrified that whoever sent them would try to blackmail her, and I shared her fear. The experience was downright traumatic. Fortunately, nothing happened after that, most likely because we contacted the police. Sophia never seemed the same around me after what happened, and I don't blame her. I hope those photos don't turn up later in my life. Story 2. My best friend Ricardo and I were both 19 years old. At the risk of sounding pretentious, we come from wealthy North Jersey families and spend our summers at the Jersey Shore. My house is in Belmar, New Jersey, and he lives in Lavallette. It was a random summer night during the week, and Ricardo was driving the two of us from my house in Belmar to Lavallette, about an hour away. I preferred hanging out at Ricardo's house because it was nicer and because the overall atmosphere at La Valette is more geared toward kids our age. If we weren't looking for a party, we could drink on one of the many private beaches we weren't supposed to visit. I could go on and on about things to do on the beach, but for the sake of brevity, I'll get straight to the point. We decided to have a quieter night as we drove down. No partying, links, or anything else we would normally do. The two of us decided to grab some beers, roll a joint, and relax on one of the private beaches under the stars. Honestly, it sounded fantastic. The two of us had been partying hard with some of our other friends, so a break from it was much needed. For those unfamiliar with the layout of La Valette, there is a beachside and a bayside. Most beaches have a very high dune and a steep drop-off as you approach the ocean. If you stood at the ocean's edge and looked back, you'd notice a fairly large hill of sand. After a few drinks at Ricardo's place, we grabbed some bikes from his garage and headed to our preferred beach. Ricardo insisted on traveling further than I had ever been, which I needed help understanding because the beaches were identical. I didn't mind a longer bike ride, so I just went for it. Ricardo eventually settled on a desolate-looking beach at the end of the road with no cars parked. Each house on the street had its lights turned off. I actually preferred this. This was back when weed was illegal in New Jersey, and we didn't want to get caught. We also had some drinks, even though we were only 19. We hid our bikes under shrubs before heading to the beach. The two of us lit our joint and smoked under the stars, the only sound being the ocean's light waves and accompanying wind. The beach stretched indefinitely in both directions, and the sand felt cool beneath our feet. While laughing and conversing, the two of us became increasingly inebriated. We eventually just laid back in the sand, gazing up at the sky full of stars, hoping to see a shooting star. That is when we heard it. I was the one who heard it first. It was almost undetectable. The sound was metallic buzzing, similar to what you'd hear in a massive gymnasium with large overhead lights. I really can't describe the sound better. It was a faint metallic buzz that the beach could not have caused. I sat up and looked at Ricardo, and I could tell when he began to hear it too. We both whipped our heads around, looking for the source of the drone in the darkness. Strangely, it was difficult to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was simply too faint to tell. We were starting to freak out, but were too scared to move. We assumed that whatever was making the noise would stop, and we wouldn't have to worry about it. When from have been location on the beach. It was far too dark, and the sound of the ocean completely drowned out whatever sounds we were making. It doesn't sound scary, but I'd lie if I said my heart wasn't racing. The drone continued flying, and after a few minutes, Ricardo motioned for me to follow him. I nodded in agreement. Leaving was clearly the best option. Like in a movie, the droning increased from 1 to 5 the moment we stood up. It took all of my self-control not to yell in fear. It wasn't a gradual shift. The sound increased in a split second and was clearly coming from our right. I felt the hairs on my neck stand up, and a wave of fear washed over me, tightening my entire body from head to toe. We stared into the darkness and saw nothing, but the drone sounded so close that we instinctively ran toward the sand dune. I had yet to learn what we were running from. All I knew was that something was very wrong and that someone, or something, was after us. Ricardo placed a firm hand on my shoulder as we approached the dune, abruptly stopping me from running further. At first I was perplexed, but then I realized what his gaze was fixed on. I looked up at the dune and saw it. A dark figure stood motionless at the top of the dune. Its arms were extremely long, nearly reaching its knees. It was ridiculously tall, and I was amazed at how still it could stand. It was incredibly terrifying. Ricardo yelled at me, breaking my gaze from the figure, and we kept running, this time parallel to the beach. We dashed to the next dune entrance and sprinted up the slope. We looked back at where we had come from as we approached the peak. I can still recall the terrifying sight that followed. Not only was the dark figure still on the dune, but there were probably 3 or 4 others standing motionless on the slope. Each one appeared to be facing us. We didn't have time to return for our bikes and instead chose to run the entire way home. We retraced our steps the next morning but couldn't find those bikes. Maybe they were stolen, or whoever or whatever was following us the night before had something to do with it. In any case, I've never had a scarier beach experience and still need help explaining most of these events. The strangest thing for me was that I couldn't figure out what the buzzing drone was, and I still hadn't heard anything remotely similar to it.